Okay, so try the algorithm this time. I will put my cap on this way and go like this. All right. Just trying to catch YouTube to get them to have interesting little photographs on there. I'm sure there's a way that I can control that, but don't know how to do it. Okay, so where did I put my stuff now? Okay, the story right now, of course, is America's rise to world power. I did want you to... What did I do with it? Anyway, I want you to know, of course, that we have these dichotomies. On the one hand, of course, the Americans have been isolationists were isolationists for much of their history. Of course, they become increasingly interventionist. That's the essential story. I want you to be aware, of course, of the dichotomy of intention, that although we've often couched our actions in the language of idealism, the reality has been, more enhancing the well-being of the United States, aggrandizing the relative power of the United States of America. I wanted you to begin to tell you why the Americans began to transition, of course, from the isolationists to the interventionists, and my first suggestion had to do, of course, with the structural foundations for that. It has to do with the very strong American economy, of course, which allowed the Americans to be the economic superpower, establishing the foundation for them being the global superpower, political superpower. The second thing was the rise of the foreign policy elite, William Seward and friends, who began to suggest that maybe it'd be a good idea for the United States to become increasingly active around the world. And then this European imperialism, which simply became like, everybody's doing it, so the Americans kind of get caught up a little bit in the mania of that moment. Now, the intriguing thing about the United States in terms of its rise to world power is that you feel like left to its own devices, it would have remained isolationist. I mean, it's kind of like, it's hard to imagine what it would be that would change them internally. Yes, there were some people, a few, just a minuscule minority of relatively powerful people, I'll admit that, who were thinking about America becoming a greater global superpower. But the vast majority of Americans thought that isolation was the way to go. They're going to continue. In fact, there are people who think that even to this particular day. Anyway, so the thing that's interesting about the American situation is that you need events to happen, okay? And the events not only have to happen, but they're external events. And these are things that kind of come out of the blue, that there's no anticipation of whatsoever, that are external to the United States of America, but in some way, the event apparatus conspires to draw the Americans into what really is not an American problem whatsoever. So we see these events beginning to occur, and to be honest with you, there are three major events that are the process of leading to the United States to its relative position of world power, and each one of them is a war. And each one is essentially external in nature, but of course ultimately drawing the Americans in. And the first event is the Spanish-American War, and the second event is the World War I, and the third, kind of the culminating event of the story, is World War II. After World War II, the United States steps forward in a very significant way to become this extraordinary interventionist country. But if you think about it, these are all three of them essentially external events that drew the Americans out of their shell and, of course, began to move them to a position of relative world power. So I'm going to want to tell you about the events, and we don't deal with World War II here, but we want to deal with the first of the two major events, which are putting the stepping stones towards, of course, becoming increasingly interventionist in their activity. And the first event, which of course becomes very important in the story, and I've already suggested to you, is the Spanish-American War. And you're wondering, why is there yellow paper? Well, I'm trying to recycle some stuff, and all of a sudden yellow paper came into play. And the Spanish-American War took place in 1898. So I want to tell you, what it was that led to the Spanish-American War. And remember that, this really is an external event. Now we have to start with a little bit just of the history of Spain in the New World. The Spanish were first, of course. Columbus sailed for the Spanish and allowed them to establish this initial foothold basically in the New World area. And it led the Spanish to create the largest of the New World empires. Ultimately, the Spanish Empire would stretch all the way from Alta California and El Norte, the northern part of California, of course, that part that would bump up against what we call Oregon, and all the way, if I can step over here, all the way to Tierra del Fuego en el Sur. So this is the, Tierra del Fuego, the southern tip of South America. Not everything in between, of course. A lot of the areas in between were not part of the Spanish Empire, but so much of it was. All of Mexico, huge chunks of South America, the Caribbean, etc. All these parts that were part of Mexico, were part of the Spanish Empire. Now, over time, the Spanish Empire began to decline, pretty precipitously after about the 1800s, the Napoleonic period. Napoleon takes over Spain, really just kind of wipes out the Spanish relative control. In some ways at that moment, all the colonies were kind of set adrift, but even after Spain re-established itself after Napoleon was defeated, they simply had really lost control. And a lot of it was the model of the United States. Those who lived in places like Mexico or South America were inspired by the Americans to go kind of the same way. And over time, this is all in the early 1800s, of course, there's going to be movements for liberation. Simón Bolívar, a critical figure in trying to create this huge little, very substantial area in South America, he wanted to call Gran Colombia. It doesn't become one country, of course, but there's multiple countries, including Venezuela, Colombia. I'm not sure what Ecuador is going to be part of that. Anyway, the people who lived there, the Criollo people, the people who were of Spanish origin but born in the New World, they sought their independence and achieved it. Mexico will achieve its independence in the 1820s. All these areas that have been part of the once great Spanish Empire began to just, fall away one by one. The Spanish, through their ineptitude and through their relative corruption and inability, are unable to sustain this empire. And it's just part of the dynamics of the modern world. Anyway, by the time we get to the 1890s, there are only two little pieces of that once great Spanish pie. And the two pieces are Puerto Rico, right here, I don't know if you guys can see Puerto Rico, and Cuba. Cuba were the last remnants of the once great Spanish Empire. And so the story of the Spanish-American War focuses on Cuba, or Cuba as we would say. Now Cuba was still controlled by Spain as we go into the 1890s. And Cuba became increasingly restive. The other parts of the New World did not want Spanish control. It shouldn't surprise us, of course, that there were those in Cuba, criollos. Criollos are those, the word just means colonists, the people who were of Spanish descent who were born in the New World era, criollos. But the criollos of Cuba were increasingly restive, of course, and there was a movement within Cuba, perhaps to also try to achieve their independence if they possibly could. Now, Cuba goes into total disarray in the 1890s. And the major phenomenon that starts this really is the fact that they finally freed the slaves of Cuba. Cuba is the last location of New World emancipation for the slaves. The United States did it in 1865 with the 13th Amendment. Brazil did it in 1888. And then Cuba finally does it in 1890. So it took them that long to finally do away with slavery. And when they liberated the slaves, but in many ways it's, worse than, but similar to the American situation. You've got all these freedmen, and yet these freedmen are finding themselves, and by the way, the huge portion of the population in Cuba, and they're finding themselves in a very difficult situation. They simply went from being the slaves of Cuba, working in the sugar plantations, to being the peasants of Cuba, working on the sugar plantations. And by the time we get to 1895, and I have to tell you, in some ways the Americans start this, because the United States decided to kind of shift their focus of the purchase of sugar from Cuba, which had really supplied the Americans in a major way, to Hawaii. We kind of de-emphasized the Cuban sugar, and that put Cuba into an economic crisis. And things get really bad in Cuba, and the peasants simply find themselves, these emancipated slaves, in just dire straits, and with nothing to do. Sometimes we call this the moral economy. If you can't respond through the vote or any other way, you sometimes turn to violence. And so we see arising in Cuba in the 1890s, by 1895, a very significant peasant uprising. The peasants, in dire straits, simply decide to just explode against whatever, against the establishment, burning down plantations, of course, killing plantation owners, just in this kind of outrage of the immorality of their relative condition. They find themselves in desperate circumstances. Now, the peasant uprising has nothing to do with the United States of America, except there were a few American plantations there, and they were impacted. But this is the first thing that kind of throws Cuba into turmoil and makes the Spanish situation there kind of difficult. The second thing that becomes, and by the way, these are like structural foundations for the Spanish-American War. I should have said that for you guys. The second thing was that there were a lot of these Cuban criollos, these people of Spanish origin born in Cuba, who were promoting the idea of independence and get in trouble for that. So they get pushed out, they're forced out of, exiled out of Cuba by the Spanish. And of course the question, if you're a Cuban exile, where do you go? Well, the answer is you go to the United States of America. In those days, they would not have gone to Florida. Florida is really not very developed at all at that time. So instead, they would go to New York. New York was the center of the Cuban exiles as they came to the United States. And they formed for themselves an organization which became known as the Cuban Junta, the Cuban Junta. And the Cuban Junta was a fundraising organization with the intent ultimately of trying to bring about the independence of Cuba. So this is like a group of exiles who were trying to do everything they can through fundraising, propaganda, even buying weapons and sending them to the peasants, to foment even more violence as far as Cuba was concerned. The Cuban junta began to be a part of the story. And the Cuban junta are kind of important because they're starting to spread the message. They want Americans to know that there are issues in Cuba and trying to get the Americans interested in maybe doing something about it, okay? Now the third major kind of structural component of what's going to happen here is the American press. I told you guys, of course, this is a time of a scandal-driven press, where they're looking for every scandal that they could possibly imagine. I told you that if it bleeds, it leads. Well, Cuba was bleeding pretty darn bad at this time. There's a lot of activity going on here. And the American newspapers, and this is their great power in some ways, has been their great power, to focus the attention of America on certain issues, Whatever they focus their attention on is, that's the way our attention kind of goes. And so through the activities of like William Randolph Hearst, have you ever heard of him, and Hearst Castle, or Joseph Pulitzer, of course, ultimately named, the Pulitzer Prize will be named after him, the American press began to focus the American attention on Cuba. There were lots of scandals going on in Cuba, and so this simply became something that they thought that they could make a lot of news out of. And I have to tell you, sometimes they're creating it. I think Pulitzer, they came up with this story of this Maria, young girl Maria, who was, going through a quinceanera, and then she was raped by Spanish soldiers, and all this kind. And they had pictures of the beautiful little girl there. It was a totally created story. Maria lived in New York, but this is the kind of thing the newspapers routinely just to stir the emotions of the Americans, of course, to attract their attention to this particular kind of issue. I don't think the press is overdoing, or the news agencies are overdoing the pandemic necessarily, but of course, just by constantly harping upon it, of course, and presenting it to us, they do inspire the fear. They can focus our attention on that, absolutely, of course, and inspire some of our fears, and hopefully, hopefully not some of our worst behaviors and worst responses to this situation. But anyway, the American press becomes major players in making sure every American knew something was going on in Cuba, and of course, beginning to draw their attention. Now, I do want you to know that things were going on in Cuba. Cuba was really messed up at this time. There were Spanish atrocities being committed at this time. The Spanish sent a general by the name of Valeriano Weyler over to Cuba. He would be called by the Cubans the Butcher, and I think that is in many ways appropriate. Weyler was frustrated. Here he had a military apparatus, but he's dealing with a peasant uprising. Just people all over the place kind of going berserk, going wild. And so he tried to figure out, what can I do about this? And he came up with this policy, which he called I can't remember exactly. I'll give you the English words in just here in a second, okay? But the idea was to bring all of the peasants into enclosed areas to control them, essentially. Recontration, something like that. Anyway, this is a foundation of a very tragic point of origin for the 20th century, setting a precedent for the 20th century. What he called these things, at least in English, were concentration camps. So the idea was to concentrate the peasant population into these areas where they could be controlled. Now the camps were really, the design was simply to concentrate them and control them, okay? But they were not designed to really sustain the people who lived there. And so, sort of by default, the concentration camps of the Spanish authorities in Cuba became death camps. We estimate that as many as 400,000 Cubans died in these camps. So they weren't designed for death in the same way the Nazis would do that, but they became centers of issues of hygiene and nutrition. They would not sustain the populations they were concentrating in, and they actually did lead to the deaths of ultimately hundreds of thousands of Cubans. So the Spanish are committing atrocities, and that's horrific in so many ways. And of course, it was increasingly playing in the American press. But if you think about it, none of this has anything to do with the United States of America. So, we have those are all like the structural issues. There's a real problem going on in Cuba, but so what? It's not really an American issue. But events would conspire to make it an American issue. And the first thing that will bring this kind of home to America is this thing called the Delon Letter. The Delon Letter. Now, the Delon Letter was written by a man who was the Spanish ambassador to America, and his name was Enrique Dupuy Delon. I've always really liked his name, Enrique Dupuy Delon. If I had had a son, my son's name would have been Enrique Dupuy Delon. In History 101, I always tell my students my son's name would be Toussaint L'Ouverture Johnson, but maybe I would combine them all together, Enrique Dupuy Toussaint L'Ouverture Johnson. Anyway, but Enrique de Delon was the Spanish ambassador to the United States of America. Now you guys all know that when you're the ambassador, you have to speak in the language of diplomacy, and carefully, because what you say is not just what you think, but it is what your nation thinks. It's the expression of your national attitude. And there have been times in history when diplomats have made a mistake and they've said the wrong thing, and that actually has and sometimes led to war. So Delon is going to make a little bit of a mistake right here, right? Now he didn't say anything wrong. He did not say anything wrong. But he wrote a letter, and it was a personal letter, and it's to somebody back home in Spain. And he writes in his personal letter, private letter, that he didn't think that there was going to be a problem with the Americans. He thought William McKinley was weak. He described them as weak, a bitter to the crowd. He goes which way over the crowd, and he didn't think that the United States was going to be any kind of major issue in dealing with the problems in Cuba. That's what the letter said, okay? Now, unbeknownst to Delon, the ambassador Delon, there were Cuban junta who had infiltrated the embassy, and they're looking for things, of course, that they can use to promote their cause. And they come across this letter, and of course, you guys know for the Cuban junta, this is gold, right? And they steal the letter, which, by the way, is against the law, as you all know, of course. And they take the letter, and they do not give it to the United States government. They took it to the newspapers, right? And so that meant that the next day, banner headlines across America. Spanish ambassador insults the president, calls him weak, a bitter to the crowd, So all of a sudden, this is, an international event, is a huge event, an international situation, of course. And, the Spanish and the Americans are in an interesting position, to say the least. Now, McKinley, the Americans were generally offended by this. It's so interesting to me that internally, we like nothing better than to kind of criticize the president. But externally, if someone from outside of the situation does the same thing, we're going to be all pissed off. It's like your little family group, You guys are endlessly ragging on each other, but someone from outside says something about your mama, and you're ready to throw down, basically. So the Americans, were offended, and William McKinley was offended. This was very personally insulting as far as he was concerned. And he decided he had to do something about it. So he's going to do something about it that becomes an act of significant provocation. He decided that he was going to send a battleship, an American battleship that was called the USS Maine. This was a battleship, second class. And when you see pictures of it, it's a very kind of an late 19th century old-fashioned looking battleship, but it was an American battleship. And McKinley's decision was to send a battleship to Havana Harbor, to Havana, Cuba, as a show of force, as a show of displeasure, to let the Cubans know, let the Spanish know that the United States of America was very unhappy with the entire situation. So in February of 1898, the Havana Harbor, the USS Maine steams down to Havana Harbor in this American, relative show of force, okay? Now, the Spanish, of course, were horrified by everything. They were horrified by the publication of the letter. They were horrified by the fact that the American president was unhappy, and they were very much horrified by the fact that now this battleship is coming to Havana Harbor. And you all know that if someone sends a battleship to your house, that's not a good thing, right? So the Spanish authorities in Cuba decided to minimize the situation as much as they possibly could. When the battleship came into Havana Harbor, actually, and by the way, it was at battle stations. These guys are ready to go. They had no idea what was going to happen. We have some letters from some of the sailors just describing, there was a little bit of foreboding sense of, could all of a sudden the guns of the castle there, I think it was called El Moro, let loose upon the battleship. But the Spanish authorities wanted to downplay everything. So instead of seeing this as an insult, they welcomed the bienvenidos to Havana. They welcomed the Americans to Havana. They actually wined and dined the captain. He got to have dinner with the governor, the Spanish governor of Cuba. So everything seems to be going swimmingly, basically. And the Americans are there, and all of a sudden it's not battle station, it's not high alert, of course. Everyone begins to relax, and so it's a symbolic statement rather than any kind of real powerful statement. That is until about 9 p.m. on the night of February the 15th, 1898. There is a huge explosion that just rocks the entirety of Havana, the Havana Harbor area. They say that the windows of almost all of the buildings that were close to the harbor just simply blown out. And what had happened was that the USS Maine had exploded in a monstrous explosion. Eyewitnesses said that the Maine rose amidship. So that means the middle of the ship is rising out of the water under the force of this extreme extraordinary explosion, okay? And I have to tell you, of course, devastating ultimate impact. At that moment, there were 350 sailors on board the USS Maine, 266 of them. The majority of them will perish in what was, up until that time, the worst naval disaster in the history of the United States of America. Now, as you can imagine, one of the great questions of this moment is, what happened to the Maine? What happened to the Maine? And I want you to know that it's intriguing. We still don't know. We simply do not know. When the war was over, they built, the Maine settled in the harbor, and the harbor wasn't really that deep, and some of the conning towers were actually above the water level. So when the war was over, they built a cofferdam around it, so that meant that they could exclude the water from the actual wreck site. I've seen some photographs they took in there. The photographs, when they look down into this area, it looks like just a scrap iron yard, and just pieces of, I think the metal, the sheeting was like 1.5 inches thick, so super thick sheets of metal, of course, that make up the hull of the ship. And they found all these really inconclusive things, like they found out that some of the metals appeared to be blown out from the interior, some appeared to be blown in from the exterior, some of it seemed to waffle both ways and ending up kind of both ways, a little bit in, a little bit out, essentially. Anyway, there was no conclusion of what exactly had happened, at least at that moment. And then later on, they towed the Hulk out into deeper water. And then later in the 20th century, there were dives that took place. I think there were some in the 1970s. They did it again in the 1990s. National Geographic did this, of course, to kind of in the centennial remembrance of the Maine. And I have to tell you that we still do not know what happened to the Maine. The two theories basically is that, number one, it could be external. So that means that maybe some monster mine, but it would have been huge. A mine would be brought up next to, or some kind of torpedo type situation next to the Maine to be blown up, of course. And that's one answer. The other answer would be that it was an internal, just an accidental explosion. Something happened within a boiler, ammunition got too overheated or something and just blew. We still do not know to this day. So there's been no significant understanding of exactly what happened to the Maine as far as Havana Harbor is concerned. I do want at least to tell you that the United States government made no assumption. They did not know what had happened, of course, and they made no particular assumption in any kind of way. But the way the press played it, of course, was increasingly with animosity towards the Spanish, like the Spanish were in some ways culpable. I want you guys to know that we tend to believe that, if it is an act of sabotage, it would not have been the Spanish. The Spanish had nothing to gain from this. It would have been like Cuban provocateurs, maybe terrorists that would have done this kind of thing, although we have no evidence they did that. But in the press, there began to be sort of an attitude that would resonate, and the attitude is then ultimately emerging in this slogan, "Remember the Maine," excuse me, and to hell with Spain. Clearly, the animosity was directed towards the Spanish. And I do want you guys to know that there's not a direct link from the destruction of the Maine to the war. I mean, there's a link, but not a direct link. So immediately after the destruction of the Maine, there isn't the Spanish-American War beginning. But here's the thing that I want you to understand about the Maine. The Maine creates the emotional catalyst which begins to turn the Americans against the Spanish. Forget about all the issues of Cuba. It turns the Americans against the Spanish and sets the groundwork for the war that will actually come. Now, as you can imagine, there's at least two responses to what's going on in terms of Cuba at that moment. There were some hawkish, jingoistic, pro-imperialist kind of Americans in the government who saw this as pretext for war. Let's go, let's do this right now. They saw it as an opportunity, of course, to begin to expand American activities around the world. The vast majority of Americans, though, were not for that, and the vast majority of the representatives in the government were not for it either. Remember that they were isolationists, and they simply, they were bewildered by what had happened, of course, but not necessarily wanting this to become a provocation that would lead ultimately to war. Now, intriguingly, it was one of those who was against anti-imperialist and a pacifist, to be honest with you, who becomes a major player in causing this all to lead to war. And this was a senator from Maine by the name of Redfield Proctor. Senator Proctor was very much a pacifist. He was an anti-imperialist. He did not like the idea of America. He was an isolationist, absolutely. Didn't like the Americans getting involved in everything. But he did a classic kind of an American government representative activity, and he decided to go to Cuba to figure out what the hell's going on. A fact-finding mission. He said, I'm going to go there and find out what's up here, what's really happening here. So he goes to Cuba. And the thing that's going to happen is the thing that really will impress him is that he sees these concentration camps. And if nothing else, he was a humanitarian. And the concentration camps were just an anathema to him. He saw them as a horrible situation. And so that became a driving force in his mind that something had to be done. So remember, I told you about, of course, the notions of idealism versus imperialism. Redfield Proctor was an idealist, and he simply thought that the Americans could not allow for the humanitarian crisis, as we would call it today, of what was happening in Cuba at that particular moment. So Proctor comes back to the United States after checking everything out, essentially. He gave an address to a joint session of Congress. So the senators and the members of the House of Representatives come together. And he described what he had seen in Cuba and the horrors of Cuba. And the end game of what he was saying was that the United States must do something to alleviate this humanitarian crisis. We must do something. And that was enough to give those who were more the hawkish element, the ability to move on this, okay? So what will happen is the United States will issue an ultimatum to Spain. There's an ultimatum that will come from the Americans to the Spanish. I don't know if you guys know much about the concept of ultimatum. In your personal life, it's a relatively uncommon phenomenon, but it occurs. Most of the ultimatums I remember were from my mom, and my mom would say, clean up your room or else, and of course I routinely decided I wouldn't go to try to find out what the or else was. I would just simply clean up my room. But there's a problem of ultimatums between nations. Each nation is independent. Each nation is sovereign. And an ultimatum means one country is telling another country what to do. And sort of by definition of sovereignty, you can't allow that to happen. You cannot allow another country to tell you what to do. That's why most of the time, of course, countries try to negotiate the situation rather than go to the level of ultimatum. But the Americans did indeed issue an ultimatum to the Spanish. And the ultimatum basically said, a number of things they were requiring. Number one, you're going to have to shut down those damn concentration camps and liberate those people. That's an untenable situation. Number two, you're going to have to allow all of the exiled Cubans to return home and to take up their position as far as Cuba is concerned. And number three, and this was the most telling of them, you need to begin negotiations for the independence of Cuba. The United States was telling the Spanish, you've got to let Cuba go. And the Spanish were polite in their response. They were willing to shut down the concentration camps. They were willing to allow for the repatriation of the Cuban exiles, but they could not allow the Americans to tell them what to do relative to Cuba. So the Spanish essentially refused the ultimatum. And remember, the ultimatum is you do it or else. And of course, now the or else had to kick in. And the or else will be that the United States of America will declare war on Spain, and thus begins the Spanish-American War. And the war will begin on April the 11th, 1898, and it will conclude on July the 17th, 1898. So if you do the math really quickly, you're going to see that the war lasted just a little over 3 months. It would ultimately become known for some as the Splendid Little War. And it became, of course, an expression of ultimate victory for the United States of America. I do want you to know that the Americans were not, it's not based upon the abilities of the United States of America, the prowess, the military prowess. The Americans were relatively inept in what they were doing. They sent soldiers down to Cuba that were dressed in woolen uniforms, of course, that were just miserable. They really struggled, of course, to survive in the tropical situation. It wasn't necessarily the aptitude of the Americans. I do want you to know that 5,400 people, Americans, died in the Spanish-American War. Only 379 of them died in battle. Most of them died from tropical diseases. They died from food poisoning. This was food that had been, like meat that had been canned for them in the jungle. If you guys remember the jungle, American meatpacking, that was often really detrimental to their well-being. Anyway, it's not the power and ability of the United States that brings the victory. It's the extraordinary ineptitude of the Spanish. The Spanish were unable to mount any kind of a significant defense for themselves, essentially. And in the end, of course, the United States will prove victorious in a relatively brief period of time. It just takes a little over 3 months for the Americans to be victorious. When the war is over, the United States will acquire for itself something of an overseas empire. Chris Johnson making do as best he possibly could. I've always loved maps, so I have a lot of atlases, to be honest with you. So I think we got the map right away. So at the end of the Spanish-American War, a little bit more like that, the United States will come into control over Cuba, of course. That'll be part of the story. I'll tell you in a little bit. We will annex Puerto Rico, so the United States will take over and annex Puerto Rico. The United States will also gain control over the island of Guam. I have no idea where it is, but I'm going to put my finger right about there, because maybe that could be where it is. I think it's over here more. And ultimately, the United States will also assume control over the Philippines. So at the end of the Spanish-American War, the United States will acquire for itself a small but relatively far-flung empire. It kind of shows you the dynamics of imperialism kind of playing themselves out a little bit in the American situation. Anyway, not a big empire in any particular kind of way, and I don't know if you guys are thinking, like, why in the hell would they be all the way out to Guam or to the Philippines? Well, the Americans decided, they'll go to war with the Spanish wherever they want to. And of course, they would never have wanted to go to war with them in Europe. Forget that, no invasion of Spain. But Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, it kind of looked like they were available. So those sort of little imperialist notions are kind of kicking into gear a little bit as the Americans began to expand their activities around the world in an unprecedented way. And do remember what we're talking about. It's it's an external situation that kind of drew the Americans in through a bunch of interesting circumstances that would ultimately lead the United States, of course, into the Spanish-American War and offer the opportunity for an expanded activity as far as the world is concerned. So this Spanish-American War kind of critical in the rise to world power. Now, the most important thing about the Spanish-American War that I want to highlight for you, though, are the results. This is what is the outcome of the Spanish-American War. This is where we really see what's going on. So I have kind of two major things that are happening here that I want you to be aware of. The first is, for the first time in American history, the Americans become somewhat active in Asia. So I want to talk about activities in Asia. The Americans now are in Asia, in Guam, more importantly in the Philippines, and are beginning to play a little bit of a role in those areas. So that becomes kind of a critical factor in terms of what's happening. So just three things that are going to happen in Asia I want you to be aware of. The first is America's first official policy statement towards Asia, and this is specifically towards China. These were called the Open Door Notes. China was in its dotage at this time. It's the end of the Qing dynasty. It's falling apart. The Europeans, the British had been victorious in the Opium Wars. They just carved up little pieces of China. Other European countries and Japan were making their way into China too. And the Open Door Notes were kind of an idealistic statement on the part of the Americans to protect the integrity of China, but to allow equal access. That's the open door, equal access to China. So the Americans wanted to trade with China too, is basically what's going on here. Okay, so this was their first significant Asian policy statement. I do want you to know that the Europeans, of course, paid no attention whatsoever. They crumpled the thing up, they threw it in the trash can. They're going to do whatever the hell they want in China. But we do have America's first official statement relative to Asian policy. Probably much more important, though, is the growing rivalry with Japan. So as the Americans arrive in the Western Pacific, right? Western Pacific, at that very same moment, this country is rising like a phoenix from the ocean, of course, and that indeed is Japan. Within a very short amount of time, Japan went from being basically a feudal entity, the Tokugawa shogunate, to undergoing what we call the Meiji Restoration, to becoming a very, very modern country by the time we begin the 20th century. So Japan is beginning to assert itself, very much westernizing itself, westernizing its military, westernizing its navy, westernizing, of course, its political apparatus, and keeping a lot of the Japanese traditions. I think that's so cool about Japan, that they modernize, and yet they really adhere to a lot of the older traditions of Japan. They westernize and do the same thing. Anyway, all of a sudden, the Japanese are becoming a major player in the area. So the Americans and the Japanese are going to develop a significant rivalry. And I'm sure you guys know that there's going to be an outcome here. I mean, this will explode into a major conflict on a December morning in 1941 at a place called Pearl Harbor. I'm sure you guys are going to guess that. So the rivalry with Japan is going to be commences as soon as the Americans arrive, as far as Asia is concerned. But of all the things that really are going to happen as far as Asia, the one that becomes the most significant is what happens in the Philippines. Now, how should I say? Well, I'll go ahead and just set this up for you guys. It will result in what we call the Filipino insurrection. And the Filipino insurrection, of course, is going to be for us a potential identification. So let me just give you a quick little story of the situation in the Philippines. The Philippines are called the Philippines after a king of Spain whose name was Philip. And I think this occurred like in the 1560s, that Spanish ships arrived in the Filipino, in that island archipelago area, and the Spanish began to assert their control over it. And that means that the Spanish controlled the Philippines from, let's say, the 1560s until the 1890s. There's a lot of years in there. I mean, can't do the math quickly enough, but I'm thinking it's over 300 years of Spanish rule. We see the dominance of the Spanish in the Philippines in a number of ways. The prominence of Hispanic names as far as the Filipinos are concerned. Corazon Aquino's I think Corazon Aquino was one of their presidents, Ferdinand Marcos, Isabella Marcos. The prominence of the Roman Catholic Church in the Philippines is another indication. The monetary unit of the Philippines is the peso. All of these are indications, of course, of this enduring Spanish situation in the Philippines. Now, like other areas of Spanish control, by the time we get to the end of the 19th centuries, the 1890s, the Filipinos were unhappy with Spanish control, and the Filipinos were restive, and the Filipinos were rising up already against the Spanish. They are in open rebellion against the Spanish. And all of a sudden, of course, into this situation come the Americans. And the Americans come on in, basically, and they're going to take over the Philippines relatively quickly, and so all of a sudden, the Filipinos are confronted with a very different kind of situation. Now, in the beginning, the Filipinos welcomed the Americans. They saw the Americans, of course, as liberators, that the Americans are going to come into this situation, they're going to liberate them from the Spanish overlord, of course, and this is going to be a much better situation. The Filipinos couldn't imagine that the Americans, who were anti-colonial in their history, would think of anything like creating a colony as far as the Philippines were concerned. So, in the first moment, at least, the Filipinos were hopeful. This is good. The Americans are going to come in. The Americans are going to provide us with our independence. Now, I do want you to know that the Americans heavily debated the issue of the Philippines, and there were many American voices who said, "No, we can't do that. We are not a colonial entity. We do not take over people." I also want you to know that some of those who said no were also racist. We don't need any more brown people as far as America is concerned. That was part of their particular argument. And William McKinley considered this very, very carefully. And I feel really bad that I didn't write this one out for you guys. I'm going to write it out right now because it's so important. So William McKinley is considering the situation and discussing it, of course, with the government. And he comes to a determination. And what he will state is, and I quote, forgive the writing, "Our little brown brothers are not ready for independence. Our little brown brothers." Now, of course, I hope you can see easily the condescending and racist attitudes of this particular suggestion. William McKinley called them their little brown brothers. So the Americans essentially decide that the Filipinos are not ready for independence. They at least left the door open that at some time they would be ready for independence, but they weren't ready at that moment. So the Filipinos who first welcomed the Americans now saw the Americans as simply new and actually more powerful overlords. And so what happens is they will explode in insurrection against the Americans too. So this becomes known as the Filipino insurrection. And unlike the Spanish-American War, it is not a splendid little war. It is a difficult, enduring slog, basically. If you look at the dates there, you see that the war will continue on from 1899 to 1902. So 3 years of significant bloodletting are going to take place before the Americans will gain control over the situation. For the Americans, this was no small deal. This was a major operation, to say the least. They will ultimately be required to send in excess of 200,000 troops, both soldiers and sailors. So a major, the largest overseas expeditionary force in American history, sent to the Philippines, to try to quell the insurrectionary situation. In the end, that will result, of course, in significant casualties. They didn't put that down for you. I had it there for you. So 200,000 troops are sent with over 500,000 killed. So the actual battle casualty rate is higher in the Philippines than it was in terms of the Spanish-American War. Spanish-American War killed more people due to tropical diseases and food poisoning and things like that, though. And it has its own kind of lethal outcome. Anyway, so this is going to be a very different kind of situation. So the war was extremely difficult because it's a war again against peasantry. So I want you I'd like to describe for you the war in the Philippines, the Filipino insurrection, as a war of atrocity. And it's a war of atrocity basically on both sides. The Filipinos had their stealth warriors, and they would descend upon American encampments with their bolo knives, and they would simply just cut throats, And there were a few times where almost entire encampments would be semi-decapitated, basically, in the night. And so here are the Filipinos, of course, in a ruthless sort of stealth warrior way going after the Americans. But the Americans responded absolutely in kind. And they were sent out on search and destroy missions where they would destroy villages, just burn everything. The same kind of images that we get ultimately from Vietnam, just burning everything. There was one moment where a commanding officer said to his soldiers, kill all males. He said, I want you to kill all males. And one subturned raised his hand and said, are we talking about boys? And he said, kill all males. Now, anyone who's not a female, I want you to kill them. And so the Americans begin to go out on this search and destroy and destruction kind of in a way to try to quell the situation. Ultimately, it will be devastating to the people of the Philippines. We do not know how many Filipinos died in the Filipino insurrection. It's the kind of thing that people do not take very good count of. And the Americans, of course, were probably very reluctant to kind of acknowledge whatever casualties they were. The conservative notion is it's about 200,000 people that were killed in the Philippines. The more aggressive one would be 500,000, 500,000 Filipinos killed in the Filipino insurrection, but clearly devastating as far as, and most of them dying not from battlefield, though we think 18,000 died in battle. And if you look up the Filipino insurrection, you see all of these, like the torture devices and the executions of these the insurgent individuals, just awful kind of imagery that comes to us from the Filipinos. Anyway, I do want you to know, the Americans will be victorious. They will quell the insurrection. There's no doubt about that. By the time we get to 1902, things are settling down. The Americans will establish themselves as the primary power in the Philippines and will do so really until after, well, with the exception, of course, of when the Japanese take it over in World War II, until after World War II, with a military presence in the Philippines until just recently, of course. Anyway, just one ironic, outcome of the situation, and that is that the Americans will ultimately employ concentration camps in an attempt to try to quell the peasantry. They too will use a concentration camp. So ironically, in the same way, the very thing that they criticized the Spanish for doing, they would do themselves. I must admit that these concentration camps were not the death camps, of course, the Spanish. It's a different situation, okay? And so I want you to understand the Filipino insurrection. It's clearly an indication of America's rise to world power. Of course, that's going to be the context. That's also, of course, going to be the significance. But I'd like you to see it kind of as the ugly side of imperialism. The reality is that if one country tries to take over another people, then that's not going to go well. People don't like that. If someone tried to take over us, we're not going to like that necessarily. And so we're seeing, this, and it's a lesson that no one ever seems to learn, right? They don't want us in Afghanistan. That's the way it's always going to be, basically. But the Filipino insurrection it represents the America's rise to world power, but it also represents this ugly side of imperialism. Well, I'm going to take another break. Here's JoJo. She's come to say hi to me, okay? And we'll get back to it pretty soon.